So, welcome to Making Magic Happen on Your Farm with Google Sheets. Here, let me see how yep, there we go. These are the worksheets, the workbooks that we're going to be working with today. My name is Elizabeth Carver. I go by Beth. And I've been farming in New Hampshire for about 9 years now. I started here working for other people, mostly in veg production. But Normative Farms, that was organic grass-fed beef, and Benedict Dairy, organic grass-fed dairy, and then also microgreens. I currently operate my little cut flower farm, which is Food and Blooms Farm. And I sit on the board of my local farmers market. I'm in Derry, New Hampshire, as the board vice president and chairperson of the vendor subcommittee. And I've recently been added as an advisory council member on the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program. And I will tell you that my spreadsheets are one of the main reasons why they asked me to be on that council as well. And then for my office cred, I have a Bachelor of Science in Operations and Project Management from this fine university that is hosting us today. And when I was getting that degree, I took a class called Managerial Accounting with Spreadsheets, which kind of like rocked my spreadsheet world. And some of that, like those guidelines, are what I'm going to share with you today. And then I'm not going to ask for you to tell me this necessarily, but just think about where you fit in the spectrum, right? Are you like an Excel nerd? Definitely up here I'm an Excel nerd. Are you proficient? Have you dabbled in Excel? And then I'll just say one more time, right, that this is an intermediate workshop, and if you've never used Excel before, this might be hard to follow. And then why are you here? Just yell answers at me for 30 seconds just so I can kind of know like what you're hoping to gain from this. Anybody?
Be able to track data and use it in the future.
Okay, cool.
Starting my own farm after working for other people.
Yay, good for you, awesome. Okay, yay, congrats. Cool. Okay, so here are some of the reasons why I assume maybe you're here. If you want to know how much it actually costs you to grow that tomato, I'm just curious, does anybody actually know how much it costs them to grow a tomato? Okay, so we're going to find out how to get that information. And how much is it costing you to grow your own seedlings? This is something that, especially in flower farming, a lot of flower farmers are outsourcing this now. It's actually cheaper for them to buy their own seedlings than it is for them to grow their own seedlings. But you can't know that if you don't know that, if you're not tracking that. And then how much is it actually costing you to go to the farmer's market, right? Not how much is it costing you in booth fees, not how much are you paying your employee to go to the market, but what's your actual real cost on that investment, and are you seeing a return on that investment? Yes?
Is it possible for us to get a copy of this afterwards?
100%. So just for anybody who came a little late, there's a sign-up sheet in the back. You can do it now, you can do it later. You're gonna get the presentation, you're gonna get the sample workbooks that we're gonna use, and my wonderful husband is recording this. Nobody is gonna be on camera. I'm gonna be the only one on camera, but we're gonna send out like a recording of it after as well. Yeah, so that, especially if you feel like I'm missing a step, one, feel free to pause me, but also don't worry about it. You can get the information later. So once you learn how to build your spreadsheets, these are the kind of things that you can do to actually start to make decisions on your farm, right? So this is sample data. This is made up. It's not real. But use my little laser pointer here. Oop. There we go. Okay, so, right, like this is kind of a real life scenario, right? If you look at your total revenue on your farm and you see like, oh man, the farm stand's only making me 4% of my total revenue. How much time am I investing in keeping that farm stand going? And would my time maybe be better spent focusing more on wedding work, right? And that kind of thing. Same thing if you take a variety of payments at the farmer's market, right? Maybe the bookkeeping aspect of Venmo is driving you nuts. It drives me nuts because they don't have like a good way to get that data out of their system. So maybe you're thinking about dropping Venmo as a payment, but then maybe you look at your numbers and you're like, man, 27% of my people are paying with Venmo. That might be a little disruptive to my sales, right? So you can start to make decisions. You also might just want to save some money, right? So, these all have a cost to them. They're great programs. They're great at what they do. But one, they cost money. Two, there's a learning curve associated with them, right? So for each of these 1, 2, 3 programs, right, say you want to do all these things, you got to learn how to use each program. Excel or Google Sheets, right? I'm going to use those interchangeably. Can do all of these things, and you only have to learn the one program, right? Like once you kind of know your way around it, you can figure out how to accomplish all of this, what this is trying to do. So again, feel free to pause me. I'm going to try to get through as much as we can, but I want to make sure that you're following what I have here. So feel free to raise your hand and just pause me. So we're going to go over some foundational vocabulary terms. Okay, so this is a workbook, cash flow magic. That's called a workbook. This is a worksheet, revenue data, revenue by channel by week. These are worksheets, right? So your workbook is a collection of worksheets. Technically speaking, the term spreadsheet refers to the program that you're using, right? So Excel is a spreadsheet program. Google Sheets is a spreadsheet program. But I'm going to use the term spreadsheet, and so does everybody else interchangeably with worksheet, right? But remember, sheet equals tabs at the bottom. Book equals the whole file that you're opening. And then this is your data. This is the stuff that you make up. You're putting this in here yourself. Excel doesn't know anything about that until you tell it. Versus this is a function, right? And this, so this is a function. This is what Excel knows, and this is how you tell Excel what to do with a function. And then this is called syntax. This is how you put in what you want to get the answer that you want, right? So that's, so you can see, and we'll go over some ifs and how it works. That's like the main function that we're going to cover today. So that just tells you how you want to put in that information with the commas and everything so that it gives you the right answer. And then this whole thing is a formula, right? Now you could have 30 different functions in a formula, right? So when you put it all together in this is the formula bar. That's your formula. Everybody with me so far? Great. Take a drink. Okay, so these are kind of basic, but they're like some amazing things that you can do with these 3 very simple functions. And then just a little refresher on algebra, because algebra and order of operations is really important when you're using Excel. So it's parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. So that's the order that your math is being done in, unless you use parentheses to tell it otherwise. Yeah, do you have a question?
No.
Okay.
Comment on that.
Yeah.
Multiplication, division, and subtraction. It depends on which one of those two, which one comes first in that.
It does not.
Oh, it does. I promise.
Oh, okay.
I'm a math teacher.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So it's addition, subtraction. If subtraction comes first, you do that. Addition comes first, you do that. And then for multiplication, division comes first, do that. If multiplication comes first, you do that.
Oh, interesting. All right. Well, no, that's fine. I'm glad we have a math teacher on board to correct me. Okay. And on that note, actually, I almost always use parentheses just to make sure. Even if I'm like, okay, I know my order of operations, but I'm just going to put it in parentheses anyway to make sure that it's going in the right direction. Okay, so before you set up any kind of workbook, you want to think about what data do you want to collect, right? So this is the Northeast Organic Farmers Association. Probably there's a lot of people needing to collect data for USDA organic certification. If you are going to try to get like disaster relief assistance or anything, there's like records associated with that you need to hand over. If you're applying for a grant, right, through NRCS, like there's going to be records associated with that. So just think about like, okay, what records am I going to need at the end of the year? Obviously, taxes, right? Everybody's got to do their taxes, so you need your revenue and your expenses for that. And then maybe you don't need to collect data for any like official governmental purposes, right? And you just want to use it to improve your business. And what you track, you improve. We know this. So why not track everything? Because every data point takes time to collect and enter. So just like we're trying to do with everything else in our lives, it's a balancing act to find out, just enough, not too much. Okay, you can use data that you already have access to. So this is my Square. I use Square at the farmer's market, right? So they're going to give you an option to export a CSV. I'm not going to tell you what CSV stands for because I don't want you to get tripped up on it because it doesn't matter. Just know that if you see CSV, it means that you can open it in a spreadsheet program. That's the file type. And then, little tip, you're not going to remember the syntax of the formula, I promise. I've never once remembered the syntax of a formula, and I've been using these spreadsheets for 12 years, right? And I have to go back to Google to remind myself what it is every single time. So just start there as a refresher. Don't even waste your time trying to bang your head against the wall. Next tip is to use ChatGPT, which is something I've recently started doing, right, as have we all probably. But ChatGPT is actually pretty good at like programming, right, which is what Excel is. And you can be a lot more conversational with it and it makes it a lot easier than like sifting through forums, right? So like before ChatGPT, we would have had to Google it and then like look at other people trying to figure out the same thing in forums and try to figure out how that fits in with what we're doing. With ChatGPT, it's a lot easier because you can just say like, hey, I want to do this. Like, what's your suggestion? But know that it is not foolproof. So you do still need to kind of know like what formulas you want to use and how you want to set it up because it's going to get you maybe like 80% of the way most of the time. Sometimes it'll get you 100% of the way, but you need to know what you're looking at to be able to use ChatGPT that way. But it's still easier than looking at forums. We're going to actually build a sample cash flow workbook. So this is cash flow, right? So this is what we're trying to track. We're trying to track our revenue in and our expenses out. So this should be pretty simple to figure out how to set up our sheet, right? So one, I'm going to rename this. I'm going to name this revenue data, okay? Every good workbook needs a data sheet. You don't do stuff on your data sheet. You input your data on your data sheet only. You do stuff on report sheets. Report sheets are going to pull that information from your data sheet and organize it in a way that actually makes it make sense to you, in a way that's useful to look at, right? So this, we're just putting in data, right? So let's say we have multiple sales channels. And that's how we want to input our data, is via sales channel, right? So let's say we go to the farmer's market. We sell wholesale. We do weddings. What are my other sales channel examples that I gave? I'm all right. Now that I'm like in front of everybody, CSA. Right? Yeah, there we go. CSA, awesome, thank you. All right, give me one more sales channel. Farm stand, yay, thank you. Okay. Farm stand. Okay, so we got our sales channel, right? We're going to want to know the date, right? We're going to want to keep track of the date that we're collecting money. And then, so I started my business by probably like a lot of people by going to the farmer's market. And I found it a lot easier to input the payment type rather than like make a new line for each payment type. So I just put payment type across the top. So I got Cash, Square, Venmo, Stripe, and check. Those are the different ways that I take payment. Stripe is like if you take online payments through your website, Stripe is a service that provides that for you. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to start putting in some sample data here. Let's just say we're working in June. Oops, what have I done? Oh, my numlock is off. Ah, there it is. Okay, so I got 6/3, 2025, let's say 6/10. And let's do 6/30. Okay, so you're doing this ideally every week. It is 100 times easier to enter data every week than it is to do it every month, and it's 1,000 times easier to enter it every week than once a year, right? So if you do it on a regular, consistent basis, it's easy breezy, lemon peasy. All right, so let's do some sample data again. I've got $150 cash, $200 in credit cards, $70 in Venmo. We don't take Stripe or check at the farmer's market. But then wholesale, we get paid via a check, right? Weddings, maybe someone does like an online like deposit on a wedding. CSA, let's say same thing, they're paying online. And then farm stand, we take cash and Venmo at the farm stand. Yeah.
Are you hitting enter after you put in these numbers, or are you just moving?
Yep, I'm hitting enter. Yep, so you just like type the number and then hit enter and it'll like bring you to the next thing. But I'm kind of using a combination, I guess. Like I am moving my cursor if I don't want to have to like go all the way over. But yeah, once you type in the number and hit enter, then your data is entered officially. Yeah. Okay, so this is in order. Here, we're gonna add one more. Okay. Oops. And
So every time you do a new date, you copy the table? Or
yeah. So yeah, thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you for calling me out and asking like, what are you doing right now? So I just want to enter some more sample data for us to work with. So what I'm doing is I just highlighted this. I did Control-C, and then I did Control-V, right, to just copy that down so I didn't have to type it again.
It's more like the date that matters as you go down. Like you can just add in your sales channels, I guess what I'm saying. Like you don't have to put all the farmers markets across one row.
Yes, it does make sense. Thank you for asking that. Yeah. Okay, so for example, right, say I'm in season and I've just finished a farmer's market, right? So I'm gonna open up my cash flow spreadsheet. I'm gonna write farmer's market. And maybe you do multiple markets and instead you name it, right, like the dairy farmer's market or, yeah. Did someone have a question? No, okay. And then say I know that the date, today's date is 6/20, 2025, right? So that's when I'm entering that date, and then I'm gonna say, okay, I collected, $125 in cash, collected $250 in Square, and then $50 in Venmo, right? So that's your weekly data entry. That's what your data entry looks like every week. Yep. Okay, good. Is everybody with me so far? Thank you. I really appreciate being slowed down because sometimes, Excel nerd, I'm just like zoom, zoom, zoom. Okay, and then real quick, just so that we have, again, some small sample data to work with. That makes it easier to understand. And let's see. Okay, so there's our sample data. Okay, so these dates are out of order, right? So let's say I want to view them in order. I'm going to hover over this little triangle right here, go down, and then sort sheet A to Z. But there's obviously a problem. So my headers get sorted with my data. So I'm just going to Control-Z, undo that. I'm going to freeze my header so that it stays at the top. And I'm going to do that by highlighting the row, going up to View, Freeze, and then up to row 1. Right? So this is easy to look at right now because we have 10 lines of data. but by the end of the season, you're gonna have like 510 lines of data, right? So now I can scroll down and my header stays at the top, so I always know what column I'm looking at if I'm trying to look at that, okay? Now I can sort by date if I want to put it in chronological order. I can sort by the sales channel if I want to group all my sales channels together. And then let's say I want to know what my revenue total is for each day. So I'm going to, so here I've highlighted this. I'm right-clicking to bring up this menu. And then I'm going to go Insert Column Left. Now I'm going to write Revenue Total. And now we get to use our handy-dandy sum function, right? That's a good basic one. And I'm going to sum all the way over to M, maybe even N, right? And I'm just summing over that far because that's what fits in my screen on my computer. And I'm giving myself room to expand. Let's say I add PayPal as a payment method, right? Now my formula is already set up so that I can just add to, column I or what have you. And then I'm going to close that parentheses, hit enter, and Google Sheets is so smart that it's going to say, oh, do you want to do this? And I'm like, yes, Google Sheets, I do, thank you. Okay, and then if and when you're adding data and you need to copy this down further, you're going to hover over this little blue dot, press that, pull down, right? And I usually just do that, as far as I can stand to drag it, and then just go back up. And then I'll add later if I need to. So this has copied this down, this formula down, and it moves its reference data according to how far down you're moving it. You're moving the formula itself, right? So this, for row 2, is summing D2 to N2. But this, with no work on our part, right, is summing D3 to N3. Okay, so we've got that. And now I've got, on one sheet, I've got a combination of formula and data input. Okay, so this is just one method that I've used that makes my life a lot easier when I'm looking at spreadsheets. I'm going to highlight this and make this a different color. And now I know that's where I'm putting my data in. I need to decide what goes in this box, right? And then I'm going to leave this as is. And this is, you can use whatever fancy colors you want, right? But just have some kind of color distinction between a cell where there's a formula and a cell where you're inputting the data. Makes it a lot easier to not mess up your formulas. And to catch yourself if you're like, oh wait, like I should have a date there and I don't, right? And then I can actually freeze the other way as well. So I can freeze up to column C. Now let's say, you probably wouldn't do this, but let's say I've got 25 different payment methods or something like that, right? Or whatever you're doing for setting up your sheet. Now I can scroll over as well, but I'm always seeing like the big information. The big important information is always on the left. Okay. So, yeah, please.
When you freeze column C and say you realize you made a mistake and you changed your farm stand Venmo amount till 50, would it still change that 165 to 175 if it's frozen?
Yes. You're saying like, okay, so.
We're like, oops, we actually made $50.
Yep. So watch, I can just put in 50 and then it changes to 350. Yep. Yep, it's always gonna, your formulas are always, and that's the fun thing about it too, is you can like run different scenarios, right? You're like, oh, well, what would happen like if I allocated 60% of such and such to XYZ, right? Okay, so every good workbook has a data sheet, and every good workbook has a data validation sheet. Okay, so this is gonna be fun. So we're gonna take our sales channels. I'm just gonna copy and paste this over. I'm gonna delete the extras. Freeze my header. And then sort so that they're all together. Okay, these are my 5 different sales channels that we have for this sample workbook. And I'm going to rename this drop downs. Okay, so now I'm going to go over to my revenue data, and I want to validate. This is what we call data validation. I want to validate the data in column A, because let's say, right, nobody knows if it's farmers with an apostrophe S or if it's farmers market, right? Like, let's say one day you put it in with an apostrophe S. If you're not validating that data, then that spelling error is going to mean that you miss whatever data is in that column, right? So this is why we use data validation. So you're going to highlight the whole column, highlight column A, go up to data, go down to data validation. It's going to pop up with this little box here. We're going to add a rule, and it's going to say, oh, is this what you want to do? And you're going to say, thank you, Google, so much. That's awesome. Thanks for knowing what I want. But you're not, it doesn't know what you want. You're not going to leave it as the default. We are going to drop down from a range. Okay, so we're going to go to drop down from a range, and now when we click our little box over here, and then we click in our little box here, we're going to go over to drop downs, and again we're going to highlight that whole column. Now we can say OK. So now let's say later on, and we're going to click done, right? It gives me the same information, but now if I want to add another, right, let's say I start taking online sales and I want to count that as a sales channel. Now, if I've used that data validation in multiple sheets, right, because we're going to do reports later, where you're going to be, you want to be typing in, right, like CSA, farmers market, so we're going to validate that as well. Now, if you need to change things up, you just change it in one place instead of having to go into your data validation rules and change it for every individual instance where you've used that data validation. Is everybody with me so far? Any questions? Okay, great. Okay, so those are the two sheets that every good workbook needs: data and data validation, which I titled drop-downs. Okay, and then again, I will say I need to look up the formulas every time I use them. So I'm not going to make you suffer through me figuring out how to use the formula right now. I'm going to go to my pre-made workbook right here, and we're just going to look at the formulas, and we're going to look at how they work, right? So I've got my data sheet, I've got my drop-down sheet, and then these, here's my little pointer. So revenue by channel by week, revenue by channel by payment, those are report sheets. Right, so that's where I was talking about, don't do stuff on your data sheet, use your report sheet to pull data from the data sheet and arrange it in such a way that it makes sense. So that's what I've done here. All right, so let's not look at this one. Yeah, okay, so we're getting real fancy here, and we're not gonna cover this necessarily, but if you're looking for something to write down for later, write down index match, because it's super, super cool. It's very fun if you figure out how to do it. And because with this index match, right, I can write anything that I want and it's going to update for me. It's not like, you know, I use that in my production plan a lot to like call out information about crops. And maybe if we have time at the end, we can take a peek at that. Okay, but on this worksheet, I've got a sum ifs function, right? So sum ifs is, I want to sum this amount, but only if it meets this criteria, right? So there's sum if, not plural, and you can only add one criteria. And then there's some ifs, and you can add, I don't know what the limit is, but as far as I'm concerned, you can add endless criteria. Usually, we're looking for 2 different types of criteria, maybe 3. Actually, I think this technically has 3. So if we look at our formula here, we can kind of guess what the syntax is. And actually, let me open this. I'm going to open this up and dual screen it. That's the other thing that I like about Google Sheets is that you can be in it twice. So I can actually look at like different sheets at the same time. I don't know if you can do that with Excel. Maybe you can. But right? So here we go. So I can look at my revenue data on one side. Give me a little more room here, please. And that's the wrong one. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So I can look at my data sheet, and then I can look at the report sheet that the data sheet's referencing. And so let's look at what it's referencing. Oh, but now I can't see the whole thing. Well, that's okay. We only need it for the first part. So this sum ifs revenue data column C, right? So these are the amounts that I want it to sum to add together, right? These are the amounts that I want it to add together, but I only want it to add them if it meets this criteria. If it meets, if this D1 matches the information in column A on my data sheet. Everybody get that? Okay. Yeah.
Which one means matches?
What do you mean? Which one mean?
So like I get the sum ifs, but it's like if D1 matches.
So that's the syntax,
Okay.
right? So this is what's called syntax, right? So this is how the spreadsheet program knows what you're trying to tell it to do. And if we went back to the PowerPoint slide, right, where it shows what that syntax is, this is the range to be summed, is what it's called. This is the criteria range, and then this is the criteria, right? So criteria range and criteria work together, and then the sum range is it's going to now say, okay, if it meets wedding, then I'm going to total this, or then I'm going to add this to whatever my total is. And then let's just make this full screen again so we can see to the end. So then I'm adding another criteria. I want to know by week. So I've got my weeks set up, and actually we'll go over how we set up the weeks, but first things first. So I want it to tell me in this box right here, if it is, I only want it to sum if what's in column B on my revenue data sheet, which is the date, I promise, I'm not going to go over there, but column B is the date on my data sheet. Only if that is greater than or equal to A2, which is right here, and that's my date. That's the first Monday or Sunday or whatever you want to put in of the corresponding week number. Does anybody use week numbers? I'm just curious. Yeah? Okay. So the second half of that, right, is because I want it to be between these two dates. I want it to be just in that week, right, that I've got revenue data again. This is my date column on the data sheet. And then is less than A2. Again, this is the reference cell, this date, plus 7 days. So that's going to give me only the totals that meets that criteria. Only the totals that are between 12/29 and 1/5 that came from weddings. So now you can start to see how, again, we're working with small data. which is a good idea. You should work with small data when you're setting up your sheets, right? Because it makes it easier to see mistakes in your formula. But now we can see, right, I can highlight this, and let's say I want to know what my farmer's market sales trend was. I can highlight that. I can go up to Insert, Chart, and then it's going to pop up with like a little line graph, right? So that's how you can kind of start to use these things to make decisions on your farm. Yes?
And can you then export that graph?
Yeah, you can just copy paste it.
And then I noticed it didn't have like dates or anything to correspond with
Yep.
the graph. You can customize the graph some with
So
information.
I can highlight this, and I think, you know what, correct me if I'm wrong, Google Sheets, but I think I can hit Control and then highlight the corresponding dates, go over to Insert, Chart, and then it'll, yeah, right? Okay. And then just real quick, how to name your sheets. You can name it whatever you want, but generally speaking, right, I've got revenue, that's my column right there, by channel, that's my information here, by week, that's another column here, right? So you're naming it like, is this, by this, by this, and that's how you know what you're looking at and what to pull up. So that's only half the story, obviously, right? Revenue is one half of the cash flow story. Then we've got expenses, but it's the same, right? So we don't have to, this is just sample data from like my books that I just quick pulled. You can set it up the same way, right? But I'm going to show you, these are the things that I kind of keep track of, right? I want to know what bank it's in, because when I'm going to log on to like an individual bank and then sit down and input all of my expenses for the week from that bank, right? So I start with bank, date, obviously, amount. Anything interesting about the amount that anybody wants to comment on? It's a negative, right? Always do your expenses as a negative, because then they can play nice with your data. If they're not expressed as a negative, then, right, like say you want to use the sum function, say you want to add together stuff to find out like, okay, like what was my cash flow for week 23, right? Like what was my net positive or negative for a certain week? You can sum that information when this is expressed as a negative, but you have to like do extra annoying stuff if you had not expressed that as a negative. Order number, I started thinking I was going to keep track of that, and I just do not. So it just doesn't even matter. Vendor, probably should have some data validation there, right? So that I can sort and know by vendor. But then I've got my budget category, and then the project, I always put a description so that if later, if I decide like, all right, I don't have time to figure out what the budget category or the project category is right now, I'm just going to put a description, and I'm going to figure it out later based on the description, right? So if you're in a time crunch, it's always good to just like put a quick description. And then again, you can do the same sort of stuff with your data sheets, like running reports. You can do this, it's the same process. Okay, so we are at 10:55, and correct me if I'm wrong, this goes to 11:15. Okay. All right, so we've got some time to look at those other workbooks. Okay, production costs, aka pricing calculator. Now we're gonna see how they kind of work together. All right, so this is how you know how much it costs you to grow that tomato. Your, here, we'll do a little, I can't think of the word for it. Spoiler alert. Okay, your overhead costs per square foot. This is something I didn't learn about until I started growing cut flowers, because this is a very common term that like greenhouse growers use, right? So this is how much on my farm it costs me to maintain a square foot of bed space. So we can take, we get that, right? It's kind of an obvious formula. It's your overhead costs. It's all your overhead costs divided by all your production area, right? So you can use Excel to calculate what you have for growing area. You can see I'm on a super small, tiny little plot there, right? And then you can use real numbers from your cash flow spreadsheet to get a pretty accurate budget estimation. And then this is just a little bonus too. You can estimate your labor costs differently, but here I have a sheet that where I can input here, right? I'm like, okay, probably gonna spend about 10 hours planning in like the winter months. And then that goes down. Then I'm not spending so much time planning, then it's like rock and roll time in like harvest, propagation, markets, all the things. So I know what I'm a one-woman show, so I know what like my weekly hours are. That's really useful, obviously. I can decide what to pay myself for certain activities. And you know, if you have multiple employees, maybe you have multiple sheets, you know, for each employee that kind of like estimates what their hours are gonna be. And then you could have another sheet that takes that data and like puts it together so you can see what your total cost is. And then we use that information to get this enterprise cost reports. So we could pretend that this is not here. So I'm just highlighting that and I can go hide, right? So I can take my total growing area. Notice how I didn't type that in. That is referencing the cell on this sheet because let's say I double my community garden plot this year. Now it's going to update what my overhead cost per square foot is according to how I've updated it. And then, you know, another example. So here's my total enterprise costs, overhead costs, which again is a calculation of these. I've taken my business overhead. I'm summing all of the amounts that meet the criteria of business overhead in my budget spreadsheet, right? So here's my business overhead. And then planning, right? I'm considering planning is also business overhead. But preparation, which is like my bed prep, that's really just in the cut flower category. That's like specific to cut flowers. So that's down here. I'm taking 100% of the flower overhead costs and the preparation overhead costs, and I'm adding it to this number. But I'm taking 60% of my overhead costs because I've got other enterprises that are like sharing that overhead cost, right? And for me, I divide right, so I've got the nursery enterprise and I sell plugs to my cut flower enterprise, and then my cut flower enterprise sells flowers to my retail, you know, bouquet making farmers markets, right? So that at any point, like I can sell plugs and I know how much they cost me. I can sell flowers wholesale and I know how much they cost me, and then I can sell retail bouquets. So it just makes it a little bit easier to get like accurate pricing. Okay, so and so once we know our overhead cost per square foot. Any questions before I move on? Questions, comments? Okay. This is my harvest log. Hope this is the right one. Darn it, it's not the right one. Oh, it's close enough. Okay. All right, so harvest log. I'm going to show you this to encourage you that you can start anywhere. Oops. Darn it. All right, I got to find the right one. Oh, man. What a bummer. But that's okay. I'm going to go here. I'm going to go here. All right. This is the one. Yeah. Okay. All right. So, bouquet making, was taking a very long time. Figuring out what my bouquet recipe was going to be was taking a very long time. So I said, I need a spreadsheet for that to help me figure out, you know, what my bouquet recipe is going to look like every week. This was the first week of the farmer's market where I decided to start that process. It is very messy. It's not, you know what I mean? This is obviously not a polished, finished product. But then every week, I'm using it, I'm iterating it, I'm adding things, I'm subtracting things, I'm making it, you know, I'm just tweaking it every week a little bit. I don't need to sit down and do this all at once, but the process of using it is actually going to inform how I want to tweak it and what makes it work for me, right? Until I get to like a pretty solid, okay, this is how I use it now. And this is, again, this is just to show you sort of what's possible, right? Like I make bouquets, right? But maybe you have a vegetable CSA, right? And you don't need to worry about what your focal, bulk, disc, etc. is, but you want to make sure that every customer gets greens and herb and fruit, right, in such a percentage in their CSA basket. So you can use it that way. And this sheet is all just using very simple formulas, right? Like sum, basic algebra with division there. I can know how many stems that I harvested that day. And then this is going to calculate, right? Like, okay, I've got 30 stems of this. If I use 3 of them to make 10 bouquets, then I've got 0 left, right? Or I have 11 stems of this. If I use 1 of them to make 10 bouquets, I have 1 left. And so whatever you need it to be, it can be for you. That's the beautiful thing about Google Sheets. So there's that. That's technically the end. We could dive into a production plan and kind of tease that a little bit if anybody would like, but are there any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm interested in producing sort of external reports. Like I keep bees, and I would like next year to start selling some honey and maybe some wax. But as I said at the beginning, I hate spreadsheets. I was an English major. I'm a word person. I'm not a tables and numbers person.
Yeah.
But I have to learn how to use this. I mean, how easy is it to take this huge tangle of numbers and produce a easy to parse visual report? This shows me exactly what I did this last season. Like something I could send somebody as a PDF, like, here's what my apiary did last year.
Yeah. So here's the thing. You got to build that, right? And you need to build it to fit your specific context. Once you build it, it can be very easy. Right. But the process of building that is not an easy process, right? Okay. That's the learning the program, that's the, you know, and you might need to use like sum ifs is a really good function to use when you're working with numbers. And like criteria, you're judging criteria against numbers. But maybe it's not so good if you're, you know, what kind of data would you be gathering, or what kind of?
Oh, you know, like, how much honey is coming out of each hive?
Okay.
You know, how many hours do I have to put in for tending the bees? How many hours into processing comb and bottling honey?
Yep.
Expenses on bottles and how much revenue I get and all of that.
Yep. Yeah. So I mean, you could build, you know, sheets pretty similar to maybe like the production cost sheet. Certainly using a cash flow sheet to keep track of your expenses and categorizing your expenses in that way. And then, yeah, again, the reason why I showed this too is to illustrate, to just start building it, just start anywhere. Just start with a blank sheet and say like, okay, what information do I need? And then use functions and algebra to get there. Yeah. And then it'll be yours, you know, and then you'll have it set up just exactly the way that you want. And yeah, you had a question.
So I know you said before about like time spent setting it up.
Yeah.
And then updating things on a weekly basis.
Yep.
But like, what does that look like for you in terms of all of this data? right?
Yeah.
Like, and how does that translate to when you're in the field? Like, do you have a blank piece of paper that's like your harvest sheet?
Great question.
I'm just trying to
Yeah,
translate
yeah,
it.
I do. I do use just like a blank piece of paper, write down like, okay, here's how many stems of zinnia I have, here's how many stems of that, I write that down. I go upstairs, I have my lunch, and I enter my data and figure out my bouquet recipe like while I'm having lunch, right? Or like thinking the day of the farmer's market, right? Morning harvest, write it down, go in, have lunch. But something I'm going to be doing this year, which I've seen other people do to great effect, is setting up a Google form for yourself, right? So you can have a form that asks you, okay, how many stems did you harvest? What was the variety? And then you can just fill out that form for yourself, and then go in and export that as a CSV, like export your answers as a CSV. And that might be a little easier, especially like if you're in the field collecting data, you got your phone, and the form makes it easy to just like type that, because you don't want to go into a spreadsheet on your phone. It's not, I don't suggest it. It's not fun. So using a form is one way to like get that information, but be able to use your phone.
That's super smart.
Yeah.
And you're not spending like a ton of time like translating it.
Exactly.
Going back and forth.
Yeah.
It's real time.
Yep.
So I got it.
Yep. And then you had a question?
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about like your harvest time. I think I saw that on one of the sheets. Like, I guess I'm interested in some flowers must take longer to harvest than others, right? Or like say that you're selling, I don't know, packets of rose petals or something, and like it has that additional labor of like pulling them off. Like, how I struggle with quantifying the labor associated with like one end product versus the other
Yeah.
if the start is the same.
Okay, so I would say, if I'm hearing you correctly, I would say for me, that's why I have my different buckets. That's why I have 3 different enterprises and not one. I've got plug production, I've got cut flower production, and I've got bouquet production, right? So in that instance, right, there's a line where, okay, this is now a sellable product, right? It's a rose. You use the example of rose petals, right? It's a stem of a rose. I could sell that at this price. But instead of selling that at this price, I'm going to buy it from myself, add labor, and turn it into something else. Does that make sense? And I would say time studies, right? Because tracking every single minute of your time is probably not realistic. But doing a time study and, you know, and like timing yourself, how long does it take me to harvest this flower, is probably pretty doable. And actually, I did see one other hand, but that is a good segue to the production spreadsheet. But did somebody else have their hand up? Yeah.
I struggle with using Google Sheets versus Excel because Excel has certain functionality that's advantageous for, you know, gathering a CSV every week. Like every week we want to know how many boxes, bags, and line bags we need to build.
Mm-hmm.
We have our orders online, we download it as a CSV. I would love to be able to use Google Sheets because then the team has access to that file in a more live way.
Yeah.
But when you download a CSV to a Google Sheet, can you consistently update it? Like, so every week I'm using the same sheet, downloading a new CSV, and then I have this one worksheet that's telling me exactly the data I want to know for that week based on that new CSV.
Yeah, so I honestly am not super familiar with Microsoft Excel and the subtle differences between Google Sheets and Microsoft Excel. But I don't know why you would not be able to download a CSV and open it into Google Sheets.
I guess I'm wanting the sheet to like open and show me the numbers that I want to see based on that new CSV every week.
So you want to add new information from a different a CSV you're downloading from somewhere, and you want to add it in.
Yeah, I want it to like have this, it's like a new report every week based on new
And
data.
how are you doing that now in Microsoft Excel? Oops.
Power Query, it's like,
Okay.
so it's
Yeah.
great and it's not because I'm the only one that can look at it.
Yeah.
And I have to make individual files for anyone else who wants to look at the same information.
Yeah.
I want to use Google Sheets, I want to get smarter with it, but I'm very stuck on Power Query.
Yeah.
I'd love to know if you have a
Yeah, unfortunately, I really don't. I don't know of any functionality that would like allow you to do that in Google Sheets, because if it were me, what I would be doing is downloading that CSV in a separate Google Sheets file and copy pasting the data over where I needed it. So, you know, that is a little manual. It doesn't sound as fancy as Power Query. And that's really the only solution to that I would know of. Yeah. Any other questions?
I just wanted to revisit the drop-downs really quick, because I noticed in one of your workbooks, you had different sets of drop-downs in different columns.
Yes.
And in your drop-down tab, okay, so I want to know how I get multiple sets of drop-downs and link them to different columns, because I could just see myself having trouble doing
Yeah,
that.
so let's do that real quick, right? So let's we'll go up to, actually, no, I can't do that. All right, we're going to go to data validation. My rules are going to pop up. Let's just say I'm going to delete my rules so I can add them again. I've highlighted column G. That's my project category. I'm going to add a rule. Go to drop down from a range. Click this, which is going to select your data range. Click in there. Now I go over to my drop down sheet, and what was I? It was project was the column I'm working on. So now I'm going to highlight that column and click OK.
All right, because in my head, I had it that in my drop-downs tab, I had to have those drop-downs the same column they would appear in my workbook.
Nope.
Okay.
It can be any column.
Thank
Yep.
you.
No, they don't have to correspond at all.
Great.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone you choose. Anything else? All right. Well, it is 11:14. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Yay. And in case anybody didn't hear, put your name and email down if you want to get the materials from today, including the video of the presentation.